Today, we proudly present Dr. Carl Safina, one of America's most eminent ecologists and the Endowed Professor for Nature and Humanity at Stony Brook University. Dr. Safina is the best-selling author and host of the PBS series Saving the Ocean. He is the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Prize and Pew, Guggenheim, and National Science Foundation fellowships, among many other honors. He will discuss his most recent book, Alfie and Me, What Owls Know, What Humans Believe. The book, along with the newly published children's version, is for sale at the back of the room, and Dr. Safina will be signing at the end of the program. Without further ado, I present Dr. Carl Safina.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for coming out on such a beautiful day. I always really appreciate anybody who would rather be indoors in the dark than outside in the sunshine. And kind of feel a little bit of pressure being here speaking to you today for maybe a couple of reasons. One is I cannot see anyone. And the other is, as you were hearing that long list of items on my resume, I heard somebody go, wow. And I thought, wow, hope I don't suck now after that introduction. So the pressure is on. Anyway, what will we talk about today? We're going to talk about the themes in this book and pay particular attention to the subtitle, which is What Owls Know and What Humans Believe, because that is going to be a lot about what we will eventually start talking about. I usually wander around a lot. I know I have to stay right here because of our friends on Zoom. So if I waddle, I have to waddle back. Okay. A few years ago, 6 years ago, a wildlife rehabilitator who was a friend of ours and was working for me and was also our pet sitter texted me this photo and said, "Do you know what kind of bird this is?" And I looked at it, squinted at it on my phone, and I said, "Well, it's a dead bird." And she said, "No, it's alive." And I said, "Well, it's a screech owl. I can tell from the beak and the feet and from the size of it, how tiny it is in your hands, that is a screech owl. What's the story here?" And she said, "Well, somebody found it on their lawn and no apparent nest anywhere in sight, called me from the list of wildlife rehabilitators, and I'm not really exactly sure what to do." So she called me partly because I did know what to do. I have had a lot of experience as being a wildlife rehabilitator. I used to also be a falconer. I've had and handled owls and hawks and many, many other kinds of birds. So I told her a couple of things that I thought we might need to do. She cleaned this bird up really beautifully. This little baby bird was covered with fly eggs. You know what happens in a few hours when those things hatch? Really gruesome to even think about. And I told her, put it on a heating pad instead of one of those really hot lights, like it's not a French fry. Put it on a heating pad, and we'll see if this bird is going to survive or not. So she did do a great job, and in a couple of days, the bird was very much alive. Okay, so what are we going to do next? We had to have a plan for how this bird would eventually get rehabilitated and released. And over the next couple of weeks, this bird started to really thrive. Now, I keep saying this bird because we didn't know the gender and we needed a name. So I thought, okay, what is a gender-neutral name for this little rascal? Hey, little rascals. What were the names of our gang people in the Little Rascals? Well, alfalfa, gender neutral. You shorten it to Alfie, sounds like Owlfie. So this bird became Alfie. And because the usual default is to refer to everything as he, if you don't know, we just decided that our default would be we'll just start calling this bird she, although we didn't know. So the plan was that we were going to do what is called a soft release. A soft release is the creature never has confinement, never is in a cage, total freedom of movement, does whatever they feel like doing, and as in the wild, eventually with owls, they will have about a month out of the nest in the parent's territory before they leave the territory. That's what they will do. So we thought, okay, we'll let her do everything around us and with us that she feels like doing, and when she's ready to leave, she will leave. So we did have her doing all kinds of stuff with us. I went clamming one morning with my daughter, and our dogs were out there helping us count the clams, and Alfie also came out. Now this was right around the time that Alfie should have been getting ready to leave the territory, should have been flying around quite a bit and learning how to hunt, because that's what she needed to do. But there was a little glitch in the plan, and that glitch was not that she liked to jump up on top of our dog Jude. The glitch was that a lot of the feathers in her wings just did not grow in, so she couldn't fly. Okay, so now what are we going to do if she can't fly? Well, she's still in her juvenile feathers, and I thought, this is just a guess, that the reason those feathers didn't come in is that at a certain stage, when she was almost dead, probably very dehydrated, and probably pretty much starved, the feather follicles must have been damaged. So the question was, are they permanently damaged or what? So in the fall, she molted into her adult plumage. And not only did she look stunning, but all of her feathers did come in. However, the problem was that it was now fall and things were getting cold. The bugs that they would normally be eating were disappearing for the winter, and without a summer's worth of hunting practice, I was really afraid that at this stage, in about November, just letting her go free, she might starve. So that was my little existential problem about, like, what are we now going to do? Because our plan is derailed. So what we did was I made a little chalet for her in the outer section of our chicken coop, and we wintered her over in there. She was very, very comfortable in there. She never tried to escape. She wasn't clinging to the mesh or anything. It was just home for her, and that was the only home she ever knew, and she was very comfortable in there. I was the uncomfortable one, because I wasn't exactly sure we were doing it exactly right, or what the next steps could be, or whether they would succeed, or what. But in the spring, I started to get her in shape, and using some falconry techniques and some minor modifications, trying to get her to be a bit of a skilled hunter. So, you know, the thing with, like with kittens, you don't have to teach a kitten to chase. They just chase. And you don't have to teach an owl to chase. They just chase. But what the owl does need to learn is that the thing that they're chasing does not want to be caught. And so I would drag a little fake mouse around on a string and make it hard for her to catch. There would be a little food on the mouse. So she got the idea of what she was supposed to do with those sharp talons and that little beak. And eventually, one day, while I was in the process of letting her out and getting her back down and putting her safely away for the night, she went out and she decided not to come down. She spent the whole day out. And I thought, well, okay, this is it. This is the big day. There is no choice, really. Life in a cage is not the life she was born to, and life of freedom is dangerous. But the only real choice was to choose the riskier, real option and give her a crack at real living. And we all know that living comes with hazards. So I left the door open that night. I went inside, and in the morning I walked out the back steps, and there was a bunch of her feathers on the path there, and I said a four-letter word very loudly. I could not believe that she got killed. One night out, and that was not something I was really anticipating, that it would be instant. And then I calmed down for a second and I thought, well, wait a second. You don't have a carcass. Something seems to have attacked her, but you don't know what happened. So we put food out and nobody took it. We put food out again and again and again and again and again, and a week passed and nobody took any food. And I had to go away to a conference in Portugal. So it was about, was it 6 hours, I think, at that time of the year. In September, 6 hours later, or 5 hours later. 5 hours, I guess. Anyway, point is, at 4 a.m., I'm in Portugal, sleeping, and my phone dings, and it's a text from my wife. And there were 3 words in that text, and they were, guess who's back. So not only was she alive, she wasn't starving, she was taking care of herself, but she decided that our backyard, place that she had gotten to know as a chick, was going to be her territory. And so she stayed there. And I had expected that once she was with us for 3 weeks and she'd fly away and that would be that, the story was writing itself, and I wasn't exactly sure what was going to happen. But by that time, we had had her for over a year in our lives, and she decided she was going to stick around in our yard, and we became very fond of one another, it is fair to say. Now, I know that all of you are thinking, wait, that's a trick photo. He definitely has a dead mouse in his mouth. And that's not the case. That's a real photo. She came down low enough for me to scratch her because she likes getting scratched. And I thought, oh, let me just take out my phone and see what happens if I turn toward her and give her like a smoochy lip. And that's what she did, right on the mouth. So, okay. Very soon after that, another problem began to develop, and that was a love triangle. Now, you can never expect a girl that looks that perfect to be single for very long. And this is really, in a way, where things got very interesting to me. We started to see and hear another owl before this picture was taken. And we saw these 2 owls chasing each other around in the yard, and it looked very aggressive. And I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know what sex Alfie was either, and I didn't know whether there was a competitor for the territory or whether the territory was actually already taken by another wild owl who, for some reason, it took me a little while to see this develop, or quite what. But it looked aggressive. And then I noticed that Alfie was less aggressive. and they would be in different trees just calling back and forth. So that seemed interesting, and it seemed to me like, whoa, maybe this is courtship going on. Okay, that would be good and interesting if that was what it was. And then the other owl would start to bring little food items. Like right here, he's feeding her a moth. And he would come with a little food item and he would offer it to her. And sometimes she took it and sometimes she didn't take it. She didn't really like being so close to him. But then eventually, she started to take it every time he offered. And he started to show up every night. And the first thing he would do would be to go off for a few minutes, come back with something little to give her. She would take it, and they began to sit quietly together. And, you know, when I was in school, people taught me, I was taught in animal behavior class, that non-humans have what's called fixed action patterns. One does something, some kind of stereotyped display, and the other gives the stereotyped response because it's automatic. There's no interior process going on other than a sheer automatic instinct that does not involve a mind because they don't have one. That's what I learned in school, and that's exactly the opposite of what I was seeing. Eventually, within about 2 weeks or so, Alfie would come out from where she was resting in the daytime, and she'd fly to a perch where they were frequently rendezvousing, and she would call for him before he showed up. So 2 weeks earlier, they were chasing each other around looking aggressive, and she was avoiding him, and now she was calling for him. So I wasn't seeing any stereotyped fixed action patterns. What I was seeing was the development of trust and a bond, and something really very recognizable with the male buying dinner all the time. So now the reason I was able to see all of this stuff is two things. One is that Alfie was completely tame, and my presence had no effect on her behavior. He was taking his cues about me from her. So although he never got tame, and I never wanted him to be tame for any reason, if he was about 30 feet away from me, like from here to the back of the room, he would just go on about doing his own stuff. So I had a fantastic opportunity to see what they would normally do on their own without a human observer, but I was a human observer. And this was going on in about February, March, April of 2020, when all of our calendars got completely erased. And that year I had a lot of places I was supposed to go, and if I had gone to all those places, I would have said, hey, we raised this owl and she's doing well, and that would have been the whole story. But because I had nowhere to go, I was watching them for 5 hours a day. I would get up a little before dawn. I would go to where Alfie was usually going to go to sleep for the day. I would pick her up somewhere in the yard. I'd see what she was doing. I would watch them interacting. I'd watch for a couple or 3 hours until they went to bed. And then I would do the same thing around sunset. And so it added up, like I said, to about 3 to 5 hours a day of watching owls. Some people say, well, how could you watch owls for 3 or 5 hours a day? And I say, well, how can you watch television for 3 to 5 hours a day? How could you sit in that cubicle for 8 hours a day for the last 20 years? I could never do those things. All right, so I was watching the development of a bond and not stereotype behavior that I was taught to expect. Another thing that I was taught was that not only do non-humans have no minds, but birds especially have no ability to change their expressions, so you can't see anything that, even if it was happening, you can't see it because they can't grin and stuff like that. So it's really hard to believe that you're taught this stuff at an institution where you're paying a lot of money to be taught, when the reality is this. Now, he is saying, that's him on the left, and he's saying, you know what, 5 hours a day, that's way too much. Leave us alone. And she is in love and situated right between the two most trusted beings in her world, me and him. So can you tell? Well, yeah. Well, eventually, courting leads to mating. You all remember this. And we finally, I really knew now that, yes, Alfie, who we've been calling she all the time, actually is, yes, a female. So I saw her checking out some tree holes in our backyard, and I got an owl nest box, and I put it on the outside wall of my writing studio, and she really liked that. So she took it right away, and oh, I think I just hit the wrong key and blacked out the entire thing. There we go. All right, so she took it right away. I think she liked it because the vertical wall means squirrels are going to have a hard time bothering them. And that's my wife looking for her mate. Not looking for her mate. I'm her mate, looking for Alfie's mate. And we named Alfie's mate +1. So, and that's because the first time, Patricia was the first one who actually saw him and said, Alfie might have a +1. So since we weren't sure whether Alfie was male or female, it was very appropriate at the time. Now, Alfie was in there a lot, coming and going from the house a lot. Everything was looking really good and really interesting, and I was really loving the whole experience. And then I wasn't seeing her much at all. She was just in the box a lot. And I figured, well, probably she has laid a clutch of eggs. I didn't know if they were fertile. I didn't know if she had eggs. I wasn't sure what was going on in there or anything, but that was the likely thing. Now, even though she was tame, I did not want to disturb her sense of total security in that box on that wall by putting a ladder up there and making it look like the place could be invaded. I just didn't want to bother her like that or frighten her or seem to somehow breach the trust or sense of security. So I was very curious as to what was going on in there, but I didn't want to go look. She started to develop, however, a pretty cool little routine where right around sunset, she would come out and fly across the yard to our bird bath. And she would take a bath, shake herself off, do a spin cycle. And this took about 5 minutes. And that gave me time to throw a ladder up, stick my phone in, and fire off a couple of shots, and run down and take a look and see. Now, it's very interesting to me that every time anybody sees this picture, everybody goes, oh. Something about this just really affects our whole body resonance, I think. And it should, because eggs are really miraculous things. And also because every bird you've ever seen came from an egg. But you've probably almost never, or maybe never, actually seen a wild bird's nest or wild bird's eggs. So it really was an extremely, extremely special thing. I didn't know if the eggs were fertile, but right around the time I thought they might be hatching, I wanted to check them out. So I reached in, I picked one up. I was going to shine a flashlight through it to see if I could see a developing embryo in there. And before I got the light up, the egg started to talk to me. I was hearing little noises coming out of the egg. Now, I didn't even see a hole in the egg, but I ran my thumb across the end and was just barely chipping. And in that first little bit of atmosphere that got in there, that little baby was starting a conversation that has been going on among birds for about 30 million years. A lot of birds do this. When I used to study terns, I saw that a lot. You pick up an egg that had a hole in it, and the little baby would start cheeping at you. The mother or the father, whoever is at the nest, in owls, it's always the mother. Whoever is there when it's hatching, that young one starts talking, they talk back, and they begin that process of bonding and probably a little bit of encouragement to keep at this bizarre and arduous thing that this little being has undertaken, having no ability to have any idea what quite is going on and what's on the other side of this hole that it's making. So a really, really profoundly beautiful little experience. I actually got quite choked up there on the ladder. Luckily, I didn't fall off. And then, yes, they hatched. All of them hatched. How small are screech owl babies? Well, they're so small that that's 3 of them on the top there compared to a mouse that their father had caught. So they start life super small. And the parents got to work right away, being really competent parents, immediately just shifting gears from courtship, romance, honeymoon, nesting, parenthood. The interactions between them changed at every shift of the gears, and now it was time to take care of the new little ones. So they began bringing soft little things. The chicks started getting big, started poking their heads out. They started bringing bigger, meatier things. And then at one point, about 2/3 of the way through their growth is their maximum rate of growth. And at that point, the parents were like frantic to just keep feeding. If I offered Alfie any kind of food, she would just take to the nest, come back, take to the nest, come back. And the father became a really very accomplished big game hunter during that time. Now, if you had said to me, do screech owls hunt at noon? Of course not. They're owls. If you had said, do screech owls kill chipmunks at noon? I would have said, no, what are you talking about? But the answer is, they don't, except when they do. So all of the young ones did really well. They got really big. They started to come out on the front porch. That's Alfie on the left and one of the young ones on the right. And then this is another place where there is no choice. They can't just stay in the security of their nest past the time. They simply have to come out and face the world that they've been getting glimpses of. And so one night after dark, I heard one of them hit the awning above the door on the studio there, and they were starting to fledge. And the next morning at dawn, they experienced the violence of the world because they were discovered by some blue jays and robins who called in reinforcements and spent the next 4 or 5 hours doing their best to kill the young owls. And getting pretty close by, for instance, knocking them out of the trees when they can't fly. So they were falling like apples to the ground. And the first time I saw that happen, I thought, whoa, is this thing all right? I mean, did it just break a wing? Is it, what's happening to it? But it turned out they are resilient little things. And if you found a baby owl on the ground that can't fly, you would, of course, know that it is totally stranded. Except that what you don't know is something that I didn't know. I never heard of this. I've never heard of it since. Baby owls will walk to the nearest tree trunk, and then they will walk straight up the tree using their little talons and waving their wings. So after that first onslaught, they did survive everything quieted down. That was the most violent few hours. Never got that way again. And they regrouped, and they were all doing well. And I said to my wife, well, we have Alfie, we have +1. We need a name for the little ones, but I can't tell them apart. So she said, well, we'll give them a group name. We'll call them The Who. So we had Alfie, +1, and The Who. And another thing that we've all learned is how the runt of the brood doesn't get enough food and then gets weaker and then gets outcompeted and eventually is going to die. And that's exactly also not what I saw. What I saw was that by dawn, they were so stuffed that they mostly didn't even want any more food. And Alfie would go and try to feed them and say, all right, come on, eat your peas, please. And they were like, I really can't eat anymore. If they did eat a little more, they would often just hop away from her when she had food. So she would turn around, see the nearest other young one, and fly to that young one and offer food to that one. It was exactly the opposite of all these starving babies fighting with each other for the last scrap of food. It was just nothing like that. But these are the images that we are all taught, that we all get. And all of these things do go on, but they don't go on everywhere all the time. It's just not that bad out there. They have lives where they take care of each other because they have relationships with each other, and it makes a difference. And through this, Alfie maintained a certain relationship with me. Now, a lot of people would say that the way that we raised Alfie around all of us was exactly the wrong way to do it because she was going to get imprinted, think she was a person, and never be able to live a normal life. And that also is exactly not the way it was. She recognized us. She recognized our dogs. If a friend came with a dog she didn't recognize, she would freak out. She was afraid of strange dogs. She would hop onto our dogs. And of course, she knew her mate and she knew her young ones. She knew where she was and who she was with. And how do we know who we are? What gives us our identity and our sense of identity? Who we are with and where we are. Exactly the same thing. Now, I'm going to play you a little video here. It has sound, so listen, and what you will hear, assuming this works, but we tried it before, what you'll hear is a sound that you will never hear described in any field guide. Field guides all tell you that screech owls make 2 different calls, and they never describe this one, and that's because this call is a call of deep intimacy. It is only uttered in very intimate moments of pure trust, often in and around the nest, but not in this particular instance. And you will see the capacity for relationality that is normal in these birds that we never imagine, never think about, never consider, but it's how they live.
Yeah, oh yeah. Oh, it's nice, right? Oh yeah.
Hey, where are you going? Now, that's nice, right? But, you know, it's a lot more than nice, I think, because birds and humans have not had a common ancestor for 300 million years. That seems like a long time to us. But in the history of life on Earth, it's really not that long. the vertebrate nervous system was already pretty well developed, pretty well fixed. Birds inherited it. We inherited it. We have such commonality with the way that the neurons are wired up and the hormones and brain chemicals that give us our senses of mood and motivation are identical. And so 300 million years later, a human being and a little owl can recognize each other, seek physical contact, and share the pleasure. And I think that that is amazing. To see a little owl, lean into that scratch like your dog might is something that really quite surprised me. And that sound she was making is really their word for love. Well, whoever thought that? And then I thought, wait a second here. Why are you surprised? I mean, I raised homing pigeons when I was 7 years old. I trained hawks and owls. I did all this wildlife rehabilitation. I spent a decade studying birds of prey and seabirds. And still, I didn't really understand the capacity for relationality that they possess and that they wield in their own lives. And my surprise was very surprising. I wanted to know, why don't we know who we are here on this planet with? Is our disconnect something that is just because we're not really intelligent enough to sense connection? Is it just a limitation of human intelligence? Or are we taught our disconnect? Those were my two questions, really one question. Are we limited or are we taught? So I didn't know how to check to see if it's because we're just not smart enough, but I thought, well, if we're taught our disconnect, what did other cultures teach about the human place in the world? So I looked into that a little bit. I looked into that quite a lot, actually. And what I found was that although indigenous people are extremely diverse in their cultures around the world, and when indigenous people, I mean people whose identity is tied into a landscape and they've lived there for a very long time, they're all very different. There are people living in the Arctic who are indigenous, and there are people who live in the rainforest. But one thing that seems to be shared universally is a sense that all life is one. All living things are relatives. In North American indigenous culture, there's this phrase we sometimes hear, all my relations, to refer to nature instead of the word nature, more of a description of relating. That all of the diversity is really also one thing, a very diverse, single, related thing. In the religions of South Asia, there is a widespread belief in reincarnation where the same soul experiences life throughout all these different living things. And that those incarnations are a way of expressing and experiencing the equivalency of all of life on Earth. It's all different, but it's also all equally valuable. In East Asia, there is this sense that the differences in the world that look like opposites are actually necessary to maintain the balance and to create the unity of the world, so that you can, this is, we call this yin and yang, and that's sort of how Westerners know it in a sort of a simplified idea. It means basically you can't have up without down, or backward without forward, or hot without cold. You can't have life without non-life. And the human role in all of this is not to upset the balances. So in all of these cultures, the original teachings were of the unity of things on earth, the unity that comes from the diversity, and the fact that all things are related, and even things that seem opposite are necessary for balance. And then we have our culture, where Plato was the first one to teach that the physical world is not a good place, that it is full of decay and disease and problems and trouble, and that there was a perfect place with what he called perfect forms somewhere off the world and outside of time. And his star student Aristotle came up with this ladder called the Scala Naturae, in which the world is made for human beings, and humans are the best thing in the world, and really the only thing that matter in the world. And everything else is lesser, and here more or less for us to use. So that right below humans are other animals, which they call animals, and below that are nice plants with nice flowers, and then there are ugly plants, and then there are rocks. And this is the natural order of things, according to Aristotle. There were later Greek philosophers who said, don't really believe that, and I don't really believe that the world was just put here for people, because there are deserts, and there are thorny things, and there are insects that bite you, and they're not here for us. But they didn't win the day as far as what most of us were taught to believe. And that's partly because there were fans of Plato, Platonist philosophers, who were also Jewish theologians. And they brought a lot of Plato's ideas about perfection being off the planet and outside of time, and the world being made by a manufacturer, a fabricator. Plato seems to be maybe the first person who came up with the idea that one of the gods was the god who made stuff. The other Greek gods, it was a big soap opera. They all had human foibles. But Plato had a fabricator god who made perfect things. And then how is it that we could imagine perfect love, a perfect circle, when we're in an imperfect world full of imperfect love and things that are out of round? Plato said, because our eternal soul has been to the perfect place. It inhabits us. It is what's thinking for us, and it wants to get back to the perfect place. So these ideas came into the Abrahamic tradition. They were really amplified in Christianity. And so, as this philosopher Crispin Sartwell wrote in the New York Times, the devaluation of the world and our disconnect from other living things is one of the most, or really the basic idea of Western culture. And the implication is that we have no responsibilities. We owe the world nothing. It is to yield us everything. Well, one day, summer before last, I got a phone call from my daughter at our house, and she said, I think our house is on fire. I just looked outside and all I see is smoke. And I said, Alexandra, I have good news. Our house is not on fire. Canada is on fire. When the good news is Canada is on fire, and that's why hundreds of miles away we can't see the sun, then you know that something is really, really out of whack. The world is being warmed mostly from the carbon dioxide from all of the combustion that we all do. And the best way to get the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere is with forests. But not only our forests burning, we are setting forests on fire. The Amazon is burning because people are setting it on fire all the time. And government policies don't do anything to really stop that. There were gigantic fires in Canada that year. There were gigantic fires in Australia, big fires in Europe. It was a year when the world was really on fire. And we can't solve problems that we are constantly perpetuating. To solve a problem, you have to sort of stop doing what is creating the problem. But we don't. And we have a system that is set up in a certain way. And the certain way is that since the world is here to yield us everything, we can take what we want. And what we want is what's called rights. We have a right to profit. We have various other rights. And what we don't have are any responsibilities. We have the Bill of Rights. We have the UN Declaration of Human Rights. We have a lot of work to do to even get there, but there is no Bill of Responsibilities or Declaration of Responsibilities. Our role in the world is not seen as a responsibility to maintain balances. We don't teach our children about their role in maintaining balances. We don't have another side to that coin of rights. We just want what we want. So here, the red line is the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere from 1960 to a couple of years ago. And you see that the net on the red line it goes up all the time. It also goes up and down all the time. The reason it goes down is that most of the land is in the northern hemisphere, and when it's summer in the northern hemisphere, trees and plants are taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And the instrumentation is sensitive enough to show that. But it also shows that every year there's a net increase. We put out more than the plants can absorb. And then all of those black arrows are all of the big international meetings and agreements to do something about this problem that is causing climate change. And as you can see, it has made absolutely no difference at all. And the reason it has made no difference at all is that we don't care. We take about half of the land in the world to grow food for humans, and we do it in very, very aggressive and very toxic ways, to say nothing about the trillions of animals that we just yank out of the ocean every year because the world is to yield us everything. Many of you remember Earth Day in 1970, when all the problems that we were having with the environment sparked the environmental movement, a huge explosion of legislation like the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. People cared. Both political parties in the US were tripping over themselves to claim credit for fixing the problems with the environment. And 20% of all Americans were involved in some sort of Earth Day activity that year. And since then, the amount of wild animals in the world has gone down by an aggregate average of 70%, 70%. Not since 1,000 years ago, since I was in high school and we had the first expression of national concern over the environment. North America has lost 1/3 of its birds. And I started doing bird banding and being involved with wild birds and studying wild birds when I was about 17 years old. And I can tell you that the difference is very noticeable. Now, 70% of all the birds in the world are what we call poultry. They're there so we can eat them. And 96% of all the mammals in the world are human beings and what we call livestock. They're there so we can eat them. We don't really know about these things or think about them or feel them that much. And that's because our education instills our dislocation. When we graduate from high school or college, we are told, congratulations, here's a balloon, here's a card, have some cake. You are now an educated person. You have graduated. And when we graduate, we don't know where our food comes from, where our water comes from, where any of the material that we use every day has come from, where our waste goes, or any of the creatures that live around us. I have a friend who's a high school teacher, and he asks his students to name 10 wild birds. They go chicken, duck, pigeon, I don't know. And then he asks them to do the same thing with wild mammals. Dog and cat, I'm a little stuck now. But we do know one thing when we graduate. We know how to buy shit. And why is that? Because we have not been made citizens, we have been made consumers. That's what they call us because that's what our usefulness is. We have been enculturated into a consumer culture. That's why it's called that. We weren't really, many of us in this room weren't really born into a world like that. We watched a lot of that start to happen, but now that's the world that we live in, consumer culture. And to be a consumer means to be disconnected from the consequences of our consumption. You don't have to see it, you don't have to feel it, you don't even have to know about it. But what would it look like to love the world instead? A lot of people think that technology, new technology, is going to somehow provide the solutions that we need. And I would say that, well, I don't believe that to be true because all technology reflects the values that create it and are used to advance the values that are behind it. What I think would really be needed to solve these problems is a moral revolution. Doesn't that sound really silly? A moral revolution. How ridiculous that is. Well, it turns out that we've had a bunch of moral revolutions, and they've made a really big difference in a lot of ways. Some of those ways are really big. Some of those ways are a little small. Many of us can remember the first time we went on airplanes, every seat had an ashtray. Changes in values are why we don't have ashtrays anymore. Those are moral things. Those are value-based things. They're not technology-based things. And I would say that all human progress, all the things that matter, all the things that we really see as good are value-based changes. And values can go really big because they're also the perfect accessory. They go with everything. You can take them everywhere. So it's time to dump an erroneous, wrong, and really destructive idea that humans are the only thing that matters in the world and that the world is made for us, and get a little bit more with how the world really is. which is we are here and everything else that is here with us has made a very long journey to be here with us. Now, there are things in physics called laws of nature or laws of physics. They're not actually laws. Nobody, made them and wrote them down and voted on them. What they are, they're consistencies that scientists have observed, and most of them are probably correct. But maybe not all the time. Now, you do know the second law of thermodynamics says that the universe tends toward disorder. If you drop a drop of ink in a bowl of water, it will spread out until the water is gray. It will never become a drop of ink in that water ever again. That is a law of the universe. Well, what the hell's going on inside an egg? You've cracked a lot of eggs. They're not very orderly at first. And then they do what? They create complexity. Well, that's not supposed to happen. Living things defy the second law of thermodynamics. They create complexity. They self-proliferate. They can repair themselves, and they act on their own behalf. A thing is alive if it can die. Living things can be injured, not just damaged. And certain things matter to living things, and so living things are what create meaning in the universe. What do we call something that defies the laws of nature? That's usually called a miracle. There are people who've spent their entire careers looking for signs of life elsewhere in the universe. They haven't found any. It's possible we're the only one. At the very least, what we know by looking out there is that life is at the very least a really, really rare thing in the universe. There's light all over the place. There's gravity acting all over the place. There are molecules and atoms all over the place. Life is very, very rare, and we might be it. So when there's a miracle, usually people take that as evidence that there's a deity, something that is big enough to break laws of the universe. But that's not what I'm talking about. This is what I'm talking about. If we try to take our little human minds and try to wrap them around all of the time and all of the diversity of life on Earth, it's completely overwhelming. The sense of being connected in some way to something that is bigger than us in space and in time is the basis for religious experience. And in a way, it's a lot easier to have this enormously profound sense of a connection through deep time and an overwhelming proliferation of living things that feel like a religious connection. Have to lighten it up a little bit here. It's getting a little dense. Well, the Pope now thinks that caring for the actual world should be a matter of religious concern. I guess that has to count as progress. And writer Paul Greenberg and I had an article in Time magazine a couple of years ago saying that this this little day that nobody really cares about anymore maybe should be considered a religious holiday. And I don't mean at all worshiping the earth or anything like that. I mean the sense of sanctity and respect and sacredness and holiness that the only life in the entire universe would, it seems to me, deserve. Or we can just make it a very literal endeavor to let other things continue to live on the only planet with life. And letting them move, letting them find their way without getting flattened. Everything from elephants to crabs. Now, to let crabs migrate to where they need to go to breed, you have to know that crabs need to migrate to a certain place to breed, and you have to care enough to want to let them do that. And as you can see here, these Pacific Islanders do know and they do care. So a little bit of coexistence doesn't really have to be so hard. You probably don't know, because I just learned this about a week ago, there are some roads on Long Island where frogs and toads needed to get across the road to the pond where they breed every spring, and there are now tunnels for them under some of those roads. It's a small drop in the bucket to what's needed, but it's happening even on Long Island, some caring and some facilitation for coexistence. Last fall, there was one building in Chicago during fall migration where 1,000 birds died at this one building in one night. Why did that happen? It wasn't exactly an accident, because they had been asked to turn the lights down and they just didn't care. We had a similar problem in New York with lots and lots of birds getting disoriented and exhausted and dying at the 9/11 memorial lights, but it turns out that all you need to do is shut the lights off for 20 minutes every hour and just let them see where they're going and let them go. It's not that hard. You just have to have a little coexistence in mind. So, what should we do tomorrow? Well, I think, for one thing, just a desire to connect the world, to keep the world in mind in everything that we do or are learning or are planning or are tooling up for. Maybe we don't need half the world's land for growing food. Maybe we can grow it vertically. If we grow it vertically and indoors, as can be done, you can see in the picture it's doable. You don't need all the pesticides. You need a fraction of the water. So my dream is connecting all these things with human dignity and the beauty of life on Earth in everything that we do and we think about. It's not technology that's going to save the world, it's our hearts. And I think that it would be good if we tried to make sure that our hearts did. So as you heard with your own ears, even owls have a word for love. So, what are some things that we can do? Well, one thing I want to emphasize is that it's not enough. There's a thing, sort of I guess in science, there's a thing necessary but not sufficient, this concept. Something that you have to do in order for the goal to be reached, but that thing is not enough for the goal to be reached. And the thing that you have to do that is not enough for the goal to be reached is to do what you can personally. Take out your recyclables. Think about what you're driving and what you're eating. Those are necessary things. But the things that will actually get it there are going to be big policies, actually. So here are some things that we need to do. Item number 2 on that list did not go well. We have a lot of work to do, not just for us and all the things that we care about, but for them and the things that they care about and the things that they need. We live in a miracle. We're part of a miracle. Why do we insist on just staying outside the miracle when we can let ourselves in? Thank you very, very much for coming. Oh, look at all the people here. Now I can see you.
Thank you so much, Carl.
Thank you very, very much for coming. And I should say, there's a guy here in the front row who, when I was 22, 23 years old, he used to invite me to come to his classes in Port Washington and bring my hawk and a couple of other creatures into his classroom. Jim Jones over here. We haven't seen each other in, I don't know, 40 years or something, right?
Well, thank you so much, Carl, for just an amazing story and then something much deeper as well that you've shared with us today. So certainly very much appreciate that. So we're going to take some questions now. I want to encourage those who are on Zoom, you can type those into the chat and we'll read those out as well. So if folks have questions, yeah.
I guess this is for you as well. Is this has this been taped?
We did record it, yes.
Recorded?
Yes.
And how will we get it?
That will eventually be posted on the library's YouTube page. Yes. Yeah.
Will he be speaking at any other library in Nassau County?
Nothing on the calendar right now. I just did a few. Nothing on the calendar right now in Nassau County.
I was sorry that my grandson wasn't here to hear you.
Thank you.
As someone who's, sorry to assume, but probably the last person in college here,
I don't think so.
I see a lot of...
I see people rolling their eyes behind you. So
I said most recent. Anyway, I see a lot of people that do want to do a lot of things, but there's ultimately no clear path towards jobs or like roles that they can take. All those paths lead towards McKinsey or banking or something that is already has the prestige built in and has the money. How do you view a path forward in terms of bringing, I guess, like talent into more important areas?
yeah, well, I think it's sort of striking and I think really symptomatic that you, how old are you? 23. 23. Had to look at your mother to see how old you were? I think it's very telling and rather symptomatic that a person who cares like you has no idea how you can do something other than go work for McKinsey because nobody told you. That's part of what I was talking about. We're not educated at all like that. Every grade we're in, we have math class. We go through several levels of history and social studies or whatever, and we have no ecology. Ecology is the relationship among living things and between living things and the physical world. That is the most important thing to have a sense of, and You don't know anything about it because your education has failed you. And education is failing pretty much everybody. And we saw that on Tuesday, the extent to which that's a catastrophe. So there are plenty of paths, actually. They're not the same path that goes to McKinsey or banking, but there are paths into scientific research and biology and ecology, and those things have structures. They have institutions, journals, they have majors. My major, I went to SUNY Purchase, and then I went to Rutgers. I just went to state schools because I didn't have the money to do any better than that. I majored in environmental science at SUNY Purchase, which is 40 minutes drive from here. And then I studied ecology at Rutgers. And what you get in those things is you're being taught by professionals in those fields who can connect you to summer work, other professionals, projects and programs. Those paths are there. And why don't you know about them? Because people don't think they're valuable enough to tell you. They think you're valuable. They think your value is to go to work for a bank. But they are there. And they're institutionalized enough that you can major in them, get degrees in them, and get jobs in them. If the path seems, if you're interested and the path is unseeable, well, welcome to my club, because when not by the time I was 23, but when I was 19, I had no fucking idea. Excuse me on YouTube. Nobody told me anything either. And I had birds and stuff like that when I was a teenager, and no one told me anything. My parents just thought, this is not a career. I once took, one of my friends said, we're having, I don't remember, it was some holiday or something. Come over to our house, some of our relatives are going to be there, bring your hawk. So I go to their house with a hawk, and this guy says to me, you're a nice kid, but where do you think you're going with this? So the problem you have is a problem I had. It's a decades-old problem, but it's quite solvable. It's just that nobody told me, and nobody has told you. But it is there. It is there. And if you want to talk about it in any more detail with me, we can do that.
Thank you, Carl. I'm just going to check upstairs if there are any questions up there on Zoom. No, nothing yet. Okay, I saw a hand over here.
Hi, Carl. One of the frightening statistics you had up there is that only 4% of the mammals are wild.
Right.
Is that a lot of that because of the huge biomass of humans and their domestic animals, or is it mostly due to, in other words, compared?
Well, you saw the slide directly before that wild animals have declined 70%. So it's because 8 billion people and trillions of cows, pigs, horses, and chickens take up a lot of room, and a lot of the food that is grown by the sun every year. Humans use about 30 or 40% of all of the new plant growth food every year. We are pushing everything out of living room. So that's why. There's only 4% of the mammals are wild. They don't have as much room to live as they had 50 years ago, certainly not 1,000 years ago.
So, is that done by biomass or is it done by individuals?
That, I think, is numbers. I think those percentages are by number.
Another question in the back here.
This is kind of a depressed question, but given the decline in the number of mammals, the continuous increase in carbon dioxide, is it possible that we're past the tipping point? Do you see reason for optimism? I
hate the tipping point concept. I don't believe in tipping points. What I believe is that really bad things happen sometimes. Imagine if you were a Sioux Indian in the 1800s or a Jew in the 1930s. Would you think it was all finished forever? Well, maybe it was. But, you know, the world actually does go on. And then people come out of the ashes and they do what they decide to do. So I don't believe in tipping points. And the other thing about this more specifically is that, you know, as you can see, I'm a bird enthusiast. And my favorite bird in the world, other than Alfie, is peregrine falcon. So when I was 15, in 1970, there was an article in the New York Times Magazine, and the title was "Death Comes to the Peregrine Falcon." It didn't say they're in trouble. It said they're doomed. There's no way that they will survive because DDT was making all their eggs break. And the same was happening to bald eagles, and the same was happening to ospreys and a bunch of other things. And they were doomed. It was game over. Well, 6 people on Long Island formed together and they sued the county, Suffolk County, to stop spraying DDT. And they surprised themselves by winning. And then they sued the federal government to stop spraying DDT, and they surprised themselves by winning. And now there are more peregrine falcons nesting in New York City on the bridges and some of the buildings than any other place in the world. Ospreys are all over the place. When I was 15, somebody I know took me fishing in Flanders. And at the pond, along the pond shore, there was a gigantic stick nest. And I knew from books that that was an osprey nest. And I couldn't believe that these birds that I would never see were here so recently that they left a nest I was looking at. Sometime about 2 years later, I saw an osprey in Cold Spring Harbor. 6 years later, I saw osprey number 2. Now, you can go to Cold Spring Harbor now, and in 10 minutes, you'll see half a dozen ospreys. So I've seen things, whales. Whales were getting totally wiped out when I was in high school. There's a bunch of other stuff, some stuff that I've worked on professionally having to do with fish and fisheries and tuna populations and things like that, that are much more abundant now than when we thought it was game over for them. So forget tipping points. You know, at the end of the book, The Old Man and the Sea, the old man tells the boy, "I'm not going fishing anymore, I'm no longer lucky." And he says, "To hell with luck, we'll make our own luck." So either we'll make our own luck or things will continue to go in destructive directions. But they're going to go somewhere and people are going to steer them.
So I'm just checking in case there's any more. Yep, we have one here.
Where is Alfie? How long ago was this? And where is Alfie and the babies?
Okay. I don't know why I tend to forget to tell you. Alfie is now 6 years old. This year, with her second husband, she fledged her 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, and 15th lifetime youngster. And last night, I went outside my back door. I heard her calling. I went inside to get her some food. And I came out while I was opening the little container, little plastic takeout container that I had the food in. She landed on my forearm. So that's where she is right now. Lifespan around 10 years in the wild and late teens in captivity, but she has not had a normal life. You know, usually what happens to them is they slow down enough that they can't catch enough food because they miss about 90% of the time in their prime. And but Alfie is subsidized. So
I think we have a question up on Zoom.
Do you have any thoughts about other interspecies frictions increasing as it appears to be happening among the human species?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question. Can you try to rephrase that? Or is that a written question?
That's a written question.
That's a written question.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't quite understand the question, but if that person could maybe retype it in a different way, maybe I would understand.
Any other Zoom questions up there? Nope, that's it. Okay, so I hand over here. Sorry, I'll be right back.
Well, I love seeing the picture of the 3 eggs in the nest, because that reminded us that we found a robin nest hanging out of what the robins thought was a tree, but was a vine up a driveway pole light. And so around that time, I read that the robins actually turn the eggs so that they're not always resting on the same side.
Yeah.
So that the embryo or something doesn't get stuck to one of the walls of the egg. I was wondering if you were able to notice that in the owl.
Well, she's in the box, so I don't see her turning the eggs. All birds have to turn their eggs, and oddly enough, not all eggs need to be turned, because reptile eggs don't get turned, because they're usually in a buried nest in the sand somewhere. Not many, almost no reptiles care for their eggs in any way. But bird eggs always have to be turned. If you have an artificial incubator, they have to be turned, or it has an automatic turner. Depends on how much money you have for your incubator. There's a question in the back there.
Yeah, here we go.
I was just curious, did she have a new +1 every season, or did they mate for a period of time? Because you said she's only on her second husband.
I don't know how old +1 was the first year, but he appeared to me to be very experienced and knew what he was doing, whereas Alfie, being a virgin, did not know what she was doing. And at first, I thought that she is not mating correctly. She doesn't have the right posture going, and she's probably not getting actually fertilized. And then one night, I saw her adopt the correct posture, and I thought, yes, girl, you got it now. And so then +1 came back in year 2. And then in year 3, which was 2022, there was no body. And that's because he died somehow. Otherwise, he would have been there. And she called and called and called and called all winter and all spring. And she cycled her hormones normally and laid 5 eggs that were infertile and did not hatch. And she sat on them an extra week. And when she came out, and she should have had babies, and when the young ones should have been around, flying around in the yard with the happy parade of the parents and all the young ones flying around, there was nobody. And this is the part where I might be projecting, but she seemed a little lonely to me. And it was then that she came down on that branch for that scratch and that leaning into it. That was in July of 2022, when she should have had a yard full of youngsters and a mate. The following winter, she called and called and called, and I thought, oh my God, I cannot go through this again. I was so nerve-wracked. And then one night, I looked out the back kitchen window at a tree that she often likes to sit in. That tree, you saw that picture of her silhouetted against the window. It was right in that exact branch. And there was another owl in the tree. And I was so ecstatic. And I watched them a lot, mostly from inside the house. A really other interesting thing, and I'm so glad that we got into this, because it's a really good part of the story, how different the personalities, individual personalities are. Because +1 was always okay with me at a distance. And when the young ones were out, one time he came flying across the yard, came a little low, he clacked his beak aggressively, and he just kept flying. That was the only time he showed me any aggression. The new one has a different voice, does not want me around the nest when the young ones are there, has hit me in the head on 2 occasions. And let me tell you, you cannot hear owls fly at all. They're not just quiet, they're totally silent. If Alfie flies in front of me like this, there is no sound. So he doesn't come at me like this where I can see him. He comes from behind. And whams, it's like getting punched. Like I'm in the woods quietly looking for the young ones, and it's like somebody comes up and punches me from behind. So that's his personality, much, much more protective. But probably he was a young one who did not have a territory and was wandering around looking for a space for himself in the world. And he found it in our yard. Here's a place. Oh, there's no male. Nobody's chasing me out. Oh, there's a female. Perfect. But I think he was young because the first couple of times I saw them mating, he didn't know what he was doing. He was like standing on her back, and I thought, those eggs cannot possibly be fertile because this dude just doesn't know what. But things were happening after dark that I didn't quite see. So all of those eggs hatched, and he came back the second year. So 5 years she laid eggs. 4 of those she had +1, nobody, and Jack and Jack.
We'll take one more question, then we're going to wrap things up.
Have you ever seen any of the kids come back? I mean, do they just completely fly the coop, or do they stay somewhat in the area?
Yep. So they hang around for about a month, and then they disperse, and they need to find their own footing in the world, and that's the way it is, and that's the way it has to be. I think the short answer is no. They've never come back. But weirdly, the summer when she had no mate, one night and one night only, at dusk, there was another owl in the tree with her. And that owl was in adult plumage, so it was at least 1 year old, but it was acting more like a juvenile. And that's my only asterisk to no, they don't come back. Because I've often wondered who that was. There are some birds that hang around with their parents for 2 or 3 breeding seasons and help them raise their siblings. And there are colonial birds, like seabirds that nest in big colonies. They come back usually to the colony they were born in. But where a bird defends a territory that has to include all the food it needs, they can't afford to just keep filling it with babies. Everybody would starve. It just can't work that way.
So I think just to wrap this up, Carl, I was thinking as you were sharing this wonderful story today, how fortunate you were to have this experience with Alfie.
It was totally magical. I mean,
yeah.
It wasn't just fortunate. It was crazily magical. And for that to happen during the 1 year when the best thing I had to do was sit in my backyard, you know, that was just incredible. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm thinking that Alfie was very fortunate to have you.
I like to
as
think
well.
so.
Yeah, and I think we are also very fortunate to have had you today. So thank you so much. So I'll just remind everybody there are books for sale in the back. Dr. Safina is going to be making his way back there to sign some more books. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, friends of the library. Have a great rest of the weekend.